On the evening of August 17th, 2025, the streets of American cities pulsed with a rare, urgent energy. From Portland to Philadelphia, from Atlanta to Seattle, tens of thousands of citizens marched under a unified banner. No to Project 2025. It wasn't a fringe slogan. It was a declaration echoing across TV screens and social media feeds. Project 2025, pushed forward by Donald Trump and his closest allies, threatened to strip autonomy from federal agencies and concentrate power squarely in the executive branch. Critics warned the plan was not reform. It was a blueprint for authoritarian control. By midnight, the protest movement had a name that everyone recognized: the 50,501 movement. The choice of numbers, May 5, 2001, was deliberate. It recalled another moment when Americans rose en masse to defend democratic institutions. For many who participated, the resonance was unmistakable. History was repeating, and the stakes were as high as ever. At the center of the unfolding narrative stood Representative Jasmine Crockett. Speaking from the steps of the Capitol late into the night, she delivered words that cut through the clamor. Project 2025 is not a promise of efficiency. It is a threat to your freedoms. When power flows unchecked, liberty dies. Her voice carried urgency and conviction, and the echo of it rippled across broadcast news. Footage of her speech circulated rapidly online, overlaid with clips from the day's protests. The contrast was stark. Citizens united in daylight, Congresswoman resolute in the dark of night. Analysts scrambled to contextualize the moment. Some commentators noted that the quick organization and mass turnout were signs of a modern digital grassroots awakening. Others warned of potential unrest should the administration proceed unchecked. What was undeniable was that August 17th would be remembered, not for legislative hearings or political spin, but for the collective roar of Americans refusing to yield. Across the country, the question hung in the air: would Project 2025 be America's future or its undoing? If August 17th was the day the people made their voices heard, August 18th was when the political establishment scrambled to respond. Inside Washington, the tremors from the protests were impossible to ignore. Early that morning, conservative media outlets attempted to downplay the scale of the demonstrations, dismissing the crowds as professional agitators or liberal hysteria. But images flooding every major network told another story. Families with children, veterans holding flags, students draped in banners, all united under the unmistakable cry of resistance. Denial was no longer an option. The White House, however, treated the movement with thinly veiled contempt. A spokesperson for Trump's allies referred to the 50,501 protests as noise without consequence, insisting that Project 2025 would advance regardless of public outcry. That phrase, noise without consequence, spread quickly online, sparking outrage and fueling the sense that ordinary Americans were being dismissed by the very leaders meant to represent them. What was meant to belittle the protests, instead, amplified their legitimacy. By midday, the pushback reached Congress. Jasmine Crockett seized the moment, stepping in front of cameras once again. When leaders describe the voice of the people as noise, she declared, they reveal exactly what this project is about: silencing dissent. If they can dismiss millions in the streets, what will they do when no one is watching? Her pointed words circulated rapidly, paired with clips of marching crowds and interviews with citizens who spoke of fear. Not abstract policy fear, but personal dread of a government no longer accountable to them. Meanwhile, political analysts highlighted the historical stakes. Commentators noted that rarely in modern history had a policy proposal triggered this level of instant, organized backlash. The comparison to civil rights marches of the 1960s or anti-war protests of the early 2000s became a recurring theme. And with every headline, Project 2025 was no longer framed as an administrative plan. It was cast as a symbol of authoritarian ambition. By August 19th, the 50,501 movement had grown beyond a single day of protests. It was transforming into a sustained national uprising. Across the Midwest, where small towns often remain on the sidelines of political theater, residents poured into main squares carrying placards that read, "Our democracy, not his power." In cities like Denver and Austin, drone footage captured massive seas of people, their chants echoing into the night. For many, this was not just politics. It was survival. The sense that Project 2025 would fundamentally alter the balance of power ignited fear, but also sharpened determination. What distinguished this moment from past demonstrations was the unifying thread. Diverse communities moving together with a shared purpose. Teachers marched beside veterans, healthcare workers joined hands with students, and even clergy from multiple faiths spoke from improvised stages, warning that unchecked executive authority endangered every citizen. The visual power of these coalitions overwhelmed the attempts of Trump's allies to minimize the protests. What the administration branded noise had become a symphony of resistance. At the heart of this unfolding movement remained Jasmine Crockett. Her words carried the weight of both urgency and moral conviction. Speaking before a packed auditorium in Atlanta, she told the crowd, "This is not just a protest. This is a battle for the soul of the Republic. If we allow Project 2025 to pass unchallenged, we will wake up in a country where government no longer belongs to the people, but to one man's ambition." The crowd erupted, her speech cutting through the fatigue and fear that often follow long days of protest. Clips of her fiery delivery went viral, spreading far beyond the protest grounds and into households across the nation. Political strategists watched with alarm. They understood that Crockett was not just voicing dissent, she was shaping the narrative. She offered language that turned anger into purpose and despair into resolve. Each repetition of her phrase, "A battle for the soul of the Republic," cemented itself in the national consciousness. By the end of the day, hashtags tied to her speech trended worldwide, fueling a sense that the 50,501 movement was no longer just a protest. It was becoming a defining chapter in America's democratic story. By August, the cracks within Washington's political establishment were impossible to conceal. What began as murmurs of unease had grown into open signs of division. Republican lawmakers who had once confidently backed Project 2025 now faced a political dilemma: align themselves with Trump's vision of sweeping executive authority, or acknowledge the tidal wave of resistance building outside their office windows. For many, the scale of the protests was no longer abstract. Constituents flooded phone lines, community leaders organized town halls, and even longtime donors began expressing concern about the chaos that Project 2025 was stirring. Inside Capitol Hill, reporters whispered about private meetings where nervous aides urged their bosses to distance themselves from the plan. Senators who had once touted its promise of streamlined governance now ducked questions in hallways, deflecting with vague reassurances. The pressure was mounting, not from partisan attacks, but from the undeniable force of a grassroots movement that showed no sign of dissipating. In this tense atmosphere, Jasmine Crockett sharpened her critique. Appearing on a primetime news broadcast, she declared, The cracks you're seeing in Congress are not about politics, they are about conscience. When leaders fear their voters more than they fear Donald Trump, democracy begins to win. Her words cut deeply, painting Republican hesitation as a symptom of moral awakening rather than opportunistic retreat. The framing mattered. It cast Project 2025 not just as dangerous policy, but as a moral line dividing right from wrong. Meanwhile, analysts pointed to the symbolic power of the 50,501 movement. What had once been dismissed as noise was now shaping the decisions of lawmakers in real time. Polling data released that same day showed a sharp drop in public support for Project 2025, even among independents and moderates, evidence that the protests were penetrating beyond the partisan core. Yet Trump and his closest allies doubled down. In a fiery statement, he accused the movement of being an elite-driven hoax designed to weaken his campaign for full control. But even that combative rhetoric carried a note of unease. For the first time, the administration was no longer speaking from a place of confidence. It was reacting defensively. The balance of power in the debate had shifted, and Jasmine's voice was one of the main reasons why. By August 21st, the 50,501 movement had evolved from scattered demonstrations into a formidable political force. What began as street-level resistance was now channeling into coordinated strategies, petitions, lawsuits, and lobbying campaigns that threatened to shake Washington's foundations. Organizers announced that in just 4 days, over 2 million signatures had been collected, demanding that Congress block any funding tied to Project 2025. This wasn't mere symbolism, it was an unmistakable show of organizational power, one that lawmakers could not easily dismiss. Legal action followed swiftly. A coalition of civil rights groups, supported by constitutional scholars, filed an emergency injunction challenging elements of Project 2025. Their argument was stark. Centralizing federal authority in the hands of one president violated both the spirit and the letter of American democracy. The announcement made headlines worldwide, drawing attention from foreign governments who viewed the plan as an alarming pivot toward authoritarianism. European leaders issued cautious statements of concern, while international media ran images of American streets flooded with demonstrators carrying banners of resistance. Amid these developments, Jasmine Crockett's role only deepened. In a televised town hall broadcast live from Chicago, she framed the legal fight as inseparable from the moral one. The courts may decide the constitutionality of Project 2025, she said, but the people will decide whether democracy survives it. Her ability to connect the procedural with the personal gave protesters language to believe their sacrifices mattered. The hall erupted with chants of 50,501, our voice, our power. The slogan spread online, turning into a rallying cry that energized supporters across the country. Inside the corridors of Congress, pressure mounted. Reports surfaced of lawmakers receiving unprecedented volumes of letters and calls, many from districts traditionally indifferent to Washington politics. One senator admitted privately to a journalist, "I haven't seen this kind of pressure since the Iraq War vote." That comparison underscored the gravity of the moment. Meanwhile, Trump and his allies dismissed the surge of petitions as manufactured outrage. Yet their rhetoric sounded increasingly defensive, an acknowledgement that the movement was no longer a nuisance. It was an existential challenge. What had started as marches in the streets was now a multi-front battle, in courts, in Congress, and in the conscience of the nation. The movement against Project 2025 was no longer confined to America's borders. It had become an international story. Major European outlets like Le Monde and Der Spiegel ran front-page headlines describing the protests as America's Democratic Reckoning. In London, demonstrators gathered outside the U.S. Embassy holding signs that read, 50501, We Stand With You. The resonance was clear. Citizens abroad understood that a shift toward authoritarianism in Washington would reverberate globally, altering alliances, trade, and even the fragile balance of international law. Within the United Nations, whispers turned into pointed questions. Diplomats from allied nations pressed U.S. representatives. Was Project 2025 a serious policy or merely campaign bluster? The lack of a clear answer unsettled them. For allies who rely on America as a beacon of stability, the image of millions protesting their own government sent shock waves of doubt. And at the center of this storm stood Jasmine Crockett. Already a rising figure in Congress, she now carried the aura of a moral standard-bearer. Her speeches circulated with subtitles in multiple languages, appearing on international broadcasts where she was cast as the face of democratic resistance. In Paris, activists projected her words, "This is a battle for the soul of the Republic," onto the side of the U.S. Embassy. The symbolic gesture transformed her from a domestic politician into a global icon. Back home, her newfound global profile only amplified the stakes. Trump's allies lashed out, branding her a traitor who was inviting foreign meddling in America's sovereignty. But that attack backfired. When paired against images of peaceful demonstrators abroad, the accusation seemed hollow. Instead, it underscored the isolation of Trump's camp, painting them as adversaries not only of American protesters, but of Democratic allies around the world. Analysts on primetime panels remarked that rarely had a single legislator's words carried such weight across continents. Jasmine, they argued, had seized a moral high ground that transcended partisan lines. The 50,501 movement was no longer just a domestic fight. It was being watched by the entire democratic world, and Crockett was its voice. The question looming over Washington was no longer whether the protests could be ignored. It was whether America could remain credible on the global stage while pursuing a plan that so many at home and abroad viewed as a direct assault on democracy itself.